In this chapter, we're going to be learning how to develop a graphical user interface using the Swing toolkit that's part of the Java Foundation classes. Swing is a collection of classes that allow you to build graphical user interfaces with things like labels and text boxes and checkboxes and sliders and combo boxes. All of the different widgets or controls that you're used to seeing in a graphical user interface. We can't cover all of these classes in this chapter, but we're going to cover the most fundamental of those. But we're going to start with a very simple example where we display Hello World in a label, just to get you comfortable with Swing programming, if you will. So let's get started. We're going to call this program swingexample.java. And the first thing we have to do is import the Swing library. So notice we write import javax.swing.star, and that will give us all of the classes. Rather than provide you with an introduction to the classes at the beginning, I'll introduce the classes as we go. We're going to look really at just two in this example, frame and label, but they're two important ones. The first thing we're going to do is start our class, swingExample. And we're actually going to create a constructor for this class, which looks a little odd. We haven't done that before, but that's another way to begin a program. So the first thing we want to do is create a frame. A frame is the window that our graphical user interface is going to be displayed in. So that object comes from the JFrame class. So we write JFrame, and then we name our frame. We're just going to call it frame. Then we call the constructor, and here we're going to put a title that will go in the title bar of the window. So Hello World application will go in the title bar. The next thing we want to do is set the size for our frame. And we'll just pick a size arbitrarily, 400 by 200. For this example, it doesn't matter that much. The next thing we have to do is we have to tell it how we want the frame to close. So that's a method called setDefaultClose And here we're going to pass a constant JFrame exit on, just like so. So that says when we press the close button to exit the program completely. The next step is to create a label. We use the JLabel class to do that. And in that label, all we're going to display is the text Hello World for a typical Hello World first program. So that's how you create a label and put some text into the label. The next step is to add the label to the frame. That's how we put widgets onto our graphical user interfaces, by adding them to the frame. So we take the label and add it to the frame. We want to be able to make the frame visible, so we call the setVisible method with true as the argument to display the class. And that's all we need for our constructor. Now we're ready to write the main program. Now this gets a little bit complex. And to explain it, I have to go into some detail that you're probably not going to understand, or you may not understand. And you're probably going to want to do some background reading. But when you're developing graphical user interfaces in Java need to run in a separate thread. And all that means is that if you understand anything about multi-threaded programming, is that you can have different parts of a program running in different threads. That allows you to have concurrent programs. There's a lot of detail in multi-threaded programming that I can't talk about in this chapter. We have a chapter on multi-threaded programming in this course, so if you haven't looked at that chapter yet, go look at it now to understand more about multi-threaded programming. But we are going to run our user interface in its own thread. So to do that, we have to call a method called invokeLater, along with the constructor to a new runnable object. And to do that, we write public void run. Then we call the constructor for swingExample, and that will have it running in a separate thread. So we close off the run definition. Then we close off the invokeLater method. This curly brace closes off the new runnable method. This parenthesis closes our argument list for invokeLater. And then we can close off the call with a semicolon. And then we're finished with main and finished with class. So at that point, we're ready to save and then compile. We'll come back, compile the program, and then run it. And here's our Hello World program with Hello World displayed in a single label. Just for fun, let's change the size. That's about the only thing we can affect right here. Let's go 350, 150. Save. Compile it again. And then run it. And you notice we have a smaller frame and a smaller application. So that wraps up this introduction to swing programming, and we haven't done very much. But like I was saying before, there's a lot of material to cover, and we need to start out simply. So a Hello World program is always the most simple way to start. And so that's how we started. Now we're ready to move to the next lesson where we're going to look in a little more detail at the different widgets that we can add to a graphical user interface. In this lesson, we're going to look at how to add text fields to a graphical user interface. So let's get started. We're going to call this program textfields.java. First of all, we'll import the Swing libraries. Then we have to have two other import statements. One to import the abstract window toolkit, that's awt.star. And then to do event handling, because we need to start learning how to do that, we also need java.awt.event.star. I'll explain about event handling and why we also needed awt.star in just a minute. So we begin our program. And the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and declare the two widgets we're going to have in our interface, a label and a text field. So we're going to declare those first. Then we're ready to call our constructor. Let me line my code up here. I went over one space too many. So for our constructor, the first thing we're going to do is instantiate our label. And I should mention what we're going to do is we're going to have a text field and a label, and we're going to type data into the text field and hit enter and put that text into the label. Nothing fancy or even all that practical. It's just a good way to test our text field and to start thinking about event handling. Text fields are instantiated with the JTextField class. There are several different ways you can call the constructor. I'm going to call it this time with a number, an integer that represents the number of characters wide the text field is going to be. After we've run our program, I'm going to come back and change that to where we instead instantiate the text field with some text already in the field. But we'll start out with just specifying a size for the field. Next, we have to create our JFrame object. You've seen how to do that already. Now, here's a new command or a new method that we're going to call setLayout. Because we have multiple widgets, we need to provide a window management system, a way to put these widgets in our frame or the window. So we're going to use something called a flow layout. You'll see how that works in just a minute. Now we're going to set the size for the frame, and we'll set it at 500/250. We also need to set our default close operation. We'll have it the same as before, which is a exit on close. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to wire our interface to handle events. And to do that, we have to do something called adding an action listener. So we do that to the text field. And what we're saying is we're saying that we want the text field to be able to respond to events that occur when the user is working with that text field. In this particular case, it's going to be when the user hits the enter key after they've typed text into the text field. And here's how we do it. It's a little complex, so let me type in without speaking too much yet. I'll come back and discuss what I'm doing here as soon as I finish. I'm almost through here. There we go. So here we say add action listener. And to do that, we call the constructor for action listener. And we tell it that when an action is performed, capture that action and take the text out of the text field, that's where getText does, and put it in the label using the label's setText method. So all we're saying in all this code is that after the user types some text into a text field and they hit the enter key, take that text and put it in the label. So after that, we're ready to add the label to the frame. We're ready to add the text field to the frame. And we can change that order in just a moment. Then we want to make the frame visible. Now we're ready for our main program. And this looks like the previous example in the last lesson. So we call the constructor for our text fields class. Close the run method, close the invoke later method, and then close the argument, and then a semicolon, close and close. So let's test it out and see how it does. Save the file, come back to our command prompt, compile the program, and then run. I type some text and hit enter, and it puts the text in the label. Notice the label is to the left of the text box because of the way flow layout works. Let's go back to our code. Let's change the order. We'll put the text field first. Let's close up our code just to keep it all looking neat. Save. Compile. And then run. Now when we type some text, it comes in on the other side. Flow layout works by simply flowing widgets onto the frame in the order that you tell them to be added. So by changing the order from the label coming first to the label coming second, we change the positioning of these two widgets. And the last thing I want to show you before we leave text fields is in this constructor, we'll change it from 20 to type text here being what will display in the text field when we run the program. Let's go to the screen, compile again, and then run. So we'll have to clear that out and see what you get. Notice that the field is the size of the text entered. So our text field box is only wide enough to display type text here, which is what we passed into the constructor. So that wraps up this lesson on text fields, and we're ready to move on to the next lesson where we're going to discuss how to work with buttons. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to add a button to a Swing program. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the old program that we wrote in our last lesson, textfields.java. We're going to make a copy of it, copy it, and we're going to start a new program called buttons.java. Then we're going to paste the old program in, and then we're going to go back and make a couple of changes right off the bat. And you can do this with find and replace. I'm just going to do it manually because there's only a few places that it needs to change. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to add a button to the form. So the first thing we're going to do is declare a button. And that's using the JButton class, as you see right there. Next thing we want to do is instantiate the button. So after we instantiate the text field, we're going to type button is equal to new, JButton, and we're going to put a caption on the button that says put text in the label so that when the user clicks the button, the text goes from the text box to the label. The next thing we want to do is add an action listener for our button. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy this action listener. We'll add it in right here where the space is. And then we're going to change it appropriately. So we're going to change text field to button. And that's really all we have to change. So now when the button is clicked, we're going to get the text from the text field and put it in the label. Simple enough. We also want to change the size of our frame for this particular lesson, so we're going to change it to 200, 150. Next thing we want to do, and actually the last thing we have to do, is add the button to the frame. We're going to put it between the text field and the label. So let's go back over the code that we added to our application. First of all, we declared a button, then we instantiated the button, then we wrote out the action listener code, the event handling code for the button, and then finally we added the button to the frame. Everything else stays as is because we already changed our call to the constructor right here. So everything's in place to run, so let's save the file. Go back to our command prompt, compile the program, and run it. Let me put the code in place where you can see it. So here's where we type our text. Here's where we click the button, and there's the text. I made it smaller than it needs to be so that everything stayed on one row. You see if I spread it out a little bit. Then we have the text field, the button, and the label all on the same line, which looks kind of funny. And I made a fairly small text field to boot. But notice how it works. And see how the flow layout works is that if our label field is too wide to fit on the line, it just drops it down below the other two widgets. Flow layout is not a perfect layout manager. It works great when we're just introducing these concepts, but later on I'll demonstrate how to use a different layout manager than flow layout. But for now it's working fine, so that's how you add a button to a GUI application. And with that, we're ready to move on to the next lesson where we're going to talk about list boxes. In this lesson, we're going to see how to work with lists and be able to select items out of a list or select an item out of a list. We'll start with a simple single selection. So let's get started. We're going to call this program lists.java. The first thing we're going to do is import the classes that we need. And we also need a fourth set of classes, and these are in Java x.swing.event.star to work with a list. The first thing we're going to do is declare a label. We're going to use that to display our selection. Then our list, which is the JList class. So we do JList list. Then we're going to get our list data out of an array. Here we're going to pick some New York City sites that tourists like to go see. So we're going to declare our array NYC sites, and we'll populate that array in just a moment. Our constructor will start out by instantiating our objects. So we have a label, followed by our array of New York City sites. So bear with me while I type a few things in here. Just two more here. And that's good enough. So we'll stop right there. Now we'll instantiate our list, and we do that by passing the array into the constructor, like so. And that will tell Java what items are going to be in the list. The next thing we need to do is we need to set a selection mode. And we do that by picking a value called single selection out of the list selection model class. So this says that when we click on a mouse, we're going to pick one item out of the list, and that will be the item selected. You'll see how that works in just a minute. The next thing we need to do is add our list selection listener. And that's a handful to type right there. And we do that by defining a void method value change. And it looks for a list selection event, which means clicking on an item. And we define a variable index, which will get the selected index value of the list item. So the first item is index 0, and the second item is 1, and so on and so forth. When we pick an item, If that value is not equal to -1, then we're going to set the value of a label to the string site to visit plus the value found in the array at that index position. That's how we pull the value out. The list doesn't actually contain the items in that sense. They're still in the array, and so we pull it out from there, from the array. Now everything else is just housekeeping. And we set the size, set the default close operation, add the list to the frame, add the label to the frame, and then make it all visible. Finally, we write our main program. And call the constructor for our lists class. And then we're finished. Okay, so let's save the file. Cross our fingers that we don't have any typos. And we don't, so let's run the program. Let me bring it into view. Here's our list of 6 items. If we select one, it shows up in the label. We can go through and select them in order or out of order. However we select them, once we click the mouse button, then it picks that item out of the array, not actually out of the list, and displays it in the label. So that's how lists work. Now, one thing we might want to add to a list is a scroll panel so that we can have a long list and have it not take up all of the frame with the list. And that's certainly something you need for any large number of items in a list. And we're going to see how to do that in the next lesson. So once again, very quickly, adding a list to a Swing application is essentially the same as what we've done for all the other widgets. The only difference is that we have to have a data source, the array, to store the list items. Then we instantiate the list item, set any properties like its selection mode, and then add a listener of some type to check for the event that we're looking for, in this case, the clicking on an item in the list, add it to the frame, and then we're set to go. So with that, we're ready to move on to the next lesson where we're going to see how to add a scroll panel to our list. In this lesson, we're going to see how to add a scroll pane to a list to make the list scrollable. And that will save some room when we want to have a long list of items. The first thing I want to do is start a new program by copying our old program to spanes.java. So then once we've done that, we're ready to open spanes.java. So the first thing we want to do is add our scroll pane to our program. So we're going to call it spane. So the first thing we do is have a declaration. After that, we're ready to instantiate it. So what we're going to do is we're going to instantiate it down here underneath our list. So we're going to say spane equals new j scroll pane, and then the argument to the constructor is the name of the list, in this case, list. So that instantiates the scroll pane. The next thing we need to do is set the size. There's a method called setPreferredSize. To do that, we call a constructor dimension with the dimensions we want for our scroll pane, and we'll just pick 120/90. After we've done that, we're ready to add the scroll pane to our frame. Now, because the list is now in the scroll pane, we don't have to add the list anymore. So we're going to comment that out, and we'll replace that line with the line frame add spane to get our scroll pane in place. And that's actually our list. So you can think of it as adding the list to the frame. Even though we say we're adding the scroll pane to the frame, we're actually adding the list because the list now includes the scroll pane. That's a little confusing. Now the other thing we need to do is we need to come up here and change all of our names from list to SPane. So we do it here. We do it in the definition of the constructor. This is always the problem with cutting and pasting. And then where we actually execute the constructor, we've got to change it there also. Make sure we got all those. And we called it plural, so let's make sure we get that right. There we go. And to recap, we declare our scroll pane. We instantiate the scroll pane, which is this line right here. We set its size, which is the line below it. We add it, the scroll pane, to the frame, which includes the list, and then we should be ready to go. So let's save the file. Come back to our command prompt window. Compile. Run it. Let me bring it into view. See how we can scroll it up and down. We can pick. Let's scroll down and pick. Let's scroll back up and pick. We can scroll across and we can scroll up and down. So that's our scroll pane. So that's how you add a scroll pane to a list and add it to your Swing application. And with that, we're ready to move on to the exercise for this chapter, where we're going to put all these different widgets into one application. And we're also going to look at a new layout for these widgets called grid layout. For this exercise, we're going to build a simple graphical user interface to perform temperature conversions from Celsius to Fahrenheit. We're going to use a grid layout instead of the flow layout to demonstrate how you can line up widgets to some extent. It's not perfect, and it still leaves you a somewhat clunky interface, but it is better than the flow layout manager. So let's start the program. We're going to call it tempconverter.java. First thing we need to do is import the different classes, so be patient with me while I do that. Now we're ready to start the program. First thing we need to do is declare the different objects, variables, and things we're going to use. So we're going to have two labels. I'll explain what they are for in a moment. We'll have one text field, one button, one string array to store the two possible temperature scales, Fahrenheit or Celsius, a list box to display the two temperature scales, and a variable temp index, which will be used to get the selection out of the list. Next, we're going to have a function, convert, that takes a temperature and a scale and performs the specified conversion. So we check to see what scale equals, and then we perform the conversion that is called for. So here we're converting Fahrenheit to Celsius. Otherwise, we convert Celsius to Fahrenheit. Now we're ready to write the constructor for our class. So here we instantiate all of our objects. This is a label that will go by the text field to enter the temperature. Out label will be used to store the converted temperature, so it's going to be empty to start with. Our text field only needs 5 places to be able to store a temperature, which is probably not going to be more than 3 places long. We'll have a button the user clicks to begin the conversion. Temps is our array for storing the two possible temperature scales, Celsius or Fahrenheit. And then we have our list, which is made up of the two temps. Next, we instantiate our frame. Here we're going to set the layout to a grid layout. And the argument for the grid layout is going to be the number of rows and columns. Now there are other arguments, but we're only going to go with the row-column argument. Next we're going to set the size And we set our default close operation as usual. Skip a space because the next thing we're going to do is create our listeners. First, we'll do our list listener or list selection listener. And for value changed, we're simply going to get the selected index and store it in our temp index variable. So that action is fairly simple. Next, we have our action listener for our button. And for the action performed method, we're going to create a variable temp that will consist of the value entered into the text field. So notice that we have to get the value from text field, convert it to integer using parseInt, and then store it in the variable. So that's a little bit different than what you're used to. And we have to get the proper scale from the temps array, so that's our next step. And then the rest of the action in the program is right here where we set the text of the label by calling the convert function with temp and scale, just like so. So we close the definition for action performed, and then close out the add action listener. Now all we have to do is add our widgets to the frame, paying attention to the order that they're added. You'll see why in a moment. Now we make the frame visible. And there we go. Last step. And call the constructor for the class. Close the run method. Close invoke later. Close main, and then close the class. There we go. So let's save. Cross our fingers we typed everything in correctly. Got it. So let's run the program. Let me put the interface in the screen. So like I said, it's not a perfect interface. Our label is very boxy, but here's what we have. We have our temperature label. Here's our text field. This is our list, and here's our button. This is our out label to display the result. So if I type in 32 Fahrenheit and click Celsius and convert, I'll get 0.0. If I turn around and write 100, go to Fahrenheit and click convert, I'll get 212. So if I type 0 and stay at Fahrenheit, it'll give me 32. So those are the conversions that I'm familiar with, going from freezing point to boiling and boiling back to freezing. So this is not an ideal interface. You certainly would not want to publish this as any type of program for the public, but it gives you an idea of what you can do. Using a modern integrated development environment such as Eclipse, which we'll cover later, you can create a much more professional looking GUI than what we've done here. But what I wanted to show you was a different method for creating the graphical user interface using the grid layout instead of the flow layout manager. So hopefully you've gained something from this exercise. You've certainly seen some of the things you have to deal with, such as converting data from one type to another to get it into a text box or to get it out of a text box. And those are the kinds of things you have to work with when you're working with a graphical user interface in a quote-unquote real-world program. But with that, we're going to wrap up this exercise, and that wraps up this chapter on graphical user interface programming using Swing.